Well, good evening. We're going to share our screen. I'm so glad you're with me. And tonight our session is going to start off, and I'm not actually sure how long it's going to take. So I've got slides and material to take us further into to 63, but we're going to see how far we go. As always, want to say if you've got questions, feel free to type them in the Zoom chat, or you can use email. It's always good to email me later. Or if you're there in Westminster in the center, of course, or any of you, you can always email Becca and she can get them to me. But tonight what we're going to be looking at is kind of the social aspect of what was going on the home front. So here's just a reminder of where we left off. Now we're going to be a little late tonight, just a smidgen maybe, because I started late, so 7:06. So we left off right here. So Antietam had happened. In my opinion, Antietam is the most important battle of the whole Civil War. It makes me sad when I go to Antietam battlefield and it does not have nearly the love of some of the more famous Virginia battlefields, or certainly not as Gettysburg. It deserves the millions that Gettysburg has received, even more so, I think. But in any case, so if you get to go, please go to Antietam. But Antietam happened, and it's a draw. It's really one of Lee's finest hours. We're going to see maybe tonight what people think is his absolute finest hour. But Antietam is really special, and it's a draw mostly because McClellan just really didn't act with any, well, he was himself. So after that, Lincoln retires him, puts a new commander in place. As you can see, in December, it was a disaster. At the same time as Antietam was happening, roughly the same time, there's another invasion of Kentucky. So in the minds of people in the North, things are bad. Things are just overwhelmingly bad, and that kind of leads us into this sense of like, well, what was happening on the home front? Kind of what was going on? How were people experiencing it in the North and the South? I mean, clearly today we're one nation again, or we're one, united group in this continent. So we'll talk about Americans, but at the same time, we're going to kind of look at it both as North and South, because at that moment, as we're in 62 and into 63, we're kind of always working from the position of the South as its own nation. Excuse me for a second. So we'll kind of just cover these topics right here and kind of what was going on. And we're going to see maybe for some of you information you haven't seen before about the war. I mean, we're studying the Civil War because it was just part of the plan, but obviously in the past, say, 2 months, there's been a lot of things that have transpired that have highlighted and emphasized the fact that we're in this great crisis. Now, I showed you before, played all my cards in front of you, that I'm a historian who believes in, at least for Anglo-American history, the last 550 years or so, that there has been a repeatable pattern. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, so there are other great historians who have been here before me. And when this happens every 80-ish years, it's transformative. And the main way that it's transforming in the great crisis moment, and we'll still be in a few more years, whether the virus of 2020 is somehow solved by the end of this year or early next year, the great crisis, in my opinion, is going to go on for a few more years, maybe even a decade. But on the other side, when we get to the other side, and we will, most of us, we get to the other side, what will be noticed is, or what has historically happened in every great crisis moment since this pattern has begun in the late 1500s, early 1500s, is that the experience of the people and government changes, right? So that's be looking forward, be looking at. And I think if you're paying attention and you think not only in the past 4 years, but the past 8 years or 12 years, you should say, oh, I sense that. I can feel that there is something changing. Because you and I remember when Reagan was president. We remember when Carter was president. Some of you have a very clear memory when LBJ was president. And these different leaders, all those men, Nixon, Ford, Kennedy, it's a very different experience right now in our expectation and response and reflection about government. At least from where I sit, that's the case. And the dust is in the air, so we don't know how it's going to land. I mean, what's going to ultimately conclude? We'll see it when we get through it. I can make some guesses, but I don't want to, not tonight. But at the same time, when you look at these great crisis moments, we say that there is a experience with government that changes. So the government changes, or our expectation as citizens change with the government. There is also transformative social study, social experience, cultural change. Some of it is clear and you sense it immediately. Some of it's sort of in the ether. It's kind of in the background, and you sort of feel it, but you can't verbalize it. And I would suggest when you go back and look at each of these great crisis moments, when you got to the other side of that 80, 90-year window, all of a sudden you could see it. And because, again, I teach at a survey level, what that has allowed me to do is to be someone who teaches, at the space shuttle view, and I can see where Alexander the Great was, and I can see where the Carthaginians were, and I can see where Charlemagne was, and all these pieces that come along. And so doesn't make me better than anybody necessarily, but I just have a grasp that has allowed me to have this deeper or more broad sweep of things. And I think we're in that same moment now. Well, I say all of that to say the Civil War was one of these moments. And I've said that before. When you look at the home front and you look at these topics that we're going to be covering, that is the same sort of thing that we will experience. That the people alive, the citizens in 1862, 63, 64, and if you go in the great crisis really goes to 75, 76. So in that 10-year, 12-year window, the citizen in, say, 1880 has a very different social, cultural norm than the citizen in 1860. And that change is seen in what is happening on the home front in the war. Remember, at this point, we've had some wars. So the Revolutionary War, the quasi-war with France, which really never came home to us, the War of 1812, which did come home to us, but still was not felt everywhere. Then the Mexican War, which was abroad, right? And so now we're having a war that is gripping the entire nation. There's no escaping it. There is a little in the north, as I'm about to say. But in general terms, everybody feels it. The numbers are massive for the time. So you're not... everybody knew somebody who was fighting and or had died and or had been injured. It's not like, so we've been at war, right, since 9/11, right? We've had a war on terror, and as far as I know, no president yet has declared victory and closed it down. They talked like they were going to, but they didn't, right? And even the war and invading in Afghanistan, we just think about Afghanistan. I think we still have troops in Afghanistan, even though both Obama and Trump said, I'm getting them out. I think we have troops there. I'm not saying we should or we shouldn't. I'm saying that most of us in America today would have a hard time finding somebody that we know personally. I have a few, you might have a few, but it's not the same. We've kind of experienced that war in kind of we've talked more about hurricanes and more about the housing bubble in 07 than we have about war. And so that crisis moment here in the Civil War really emphasizes and pushes this. So when you look at kind of the experience, this transforming moment of kind of war as a thing you talked about distant to a suddenly war that's in your face. I mean, famously, it's a battle between brothers. It's a war between brothers. My family had this. My direct ancestor fought for the Union. His cousin, who we're not sure they actually knew each other per se, but his cousin was a captain and ultimately a major in the Confederate Army from North Carolina. They fought at least twice on the same battlefield, and we are aware that they were both there. And one of those battles, at least the way their units were lined up, as I've gone into detail on those battles, they were across the field from each other, right? But war is kind of this vague thing. Here's this great quote, usually it's attributed to Erasmus, but it's from a Greek poet named Pindar, who talks really to people like myself, who've no experience of it, that war seems sweet. And of course, that's famously, you should go, wait, that's not like the thing I've heard Robert E. Lee said. Supposedly at the Battle of Fredericksburg, which you notice we just kind of blitzed past it. Burnside stumbles in to try to attack across the Rappahannock River, right through a city, uphill. Is a terrible decision. He's a terrible general. He was fired because of it. He was moved somewhere else, but it was just a horrible, horrible experience. And Lee, supposedly saying this to Longstreet, looks down on the battlefield and just notes how horrible it was watching the Union soldiers try to charge uphill, which would be a silly thing to do in any battle. And so the war is not only on the battlefield, but it's in the home front. And of course, you may know Sherman will become most famous with this, which we'll see later in August, with his march through Georgia, although he's not really the first one. Pope, leading into the Second Battle of Bull Run, is the first one to really kind of start turning the screws on the civilian. And this is from a wonderful letter. It's a very long letter. I'd read the whole thing to you, but it'd take our whole time. Where Sherman's responding to criticism. One of the things that's interesting in the war, all the generals, North and South, would get personal letters delivered to them to the battlefield from friends and critics. And so they kind of keep up their ongoing correspondence. And if you're interested in some of these, particularly the famous generals, you can sometimes find their letters at college or university, sometimes in book form, and you can read about their experience in writing it. And so he's responding to a man from Cincinnati, Ohio, but who has friends in, and I said Cincinnati, but it's actually Louisville. I apologize. It's right there. It's Louisville. But so in Kentucky, and he's complaining about how some people have been treated and how he's been treated by Union forces. And so Sherman's making the point here, and I kind of bolded the key part about this, what he says, is that, war is what the South wanted. That's his argument. Now, obviously, there might be Southerners who disagree with that. They would say, we just want to be left alone. But that Sherman would say, left alone if we accept division. And earlier in the letter, he's like, we're not accepting division. That's not an option. So again, you're going to get the back and forth there if someone was defending the Southern view or what Mr. Guthrie here is saying. And so we want to give them all they want. Not a word of argument, not a sign of let up, no cave in to either we are whipped or they are. And then in the same time, and this is in 64 when he's writing this, you see the letter that he writes to the citizens of Atlanta who are unhappy with him after the siege happens. And again, we'll get there. And his war is cruelty, and you can't refine it. So the point is that as the war kind of moves along, it's going to come home into the home front. Now, in 61, they didn't really notice. In 62, they didn't notice till Shiloh, really till Grant starts invading Tennessee. All of a sudden, Southerners started noticing. And then, of course, we know on the eastern side, Lee starts invading, doesn't really get to Pennsylvania, but Pennsylvanians were aware that Lee was coming. So, all of a sudden the war is now showing up in homes. And the experience on the home front kind of, plays this pretty big role, right? Now for the North, there some of the transformation is, as you can see there, we got printed money for the first time. Inflation happened. The government was spending more money now than it had ever spent previously. And as they spent money, and there wasn't really as a sound of financial policy as one might have imagined, inflation took off. The greenback, which you and I know becomes our dollar, remains somewhat stable as opposed to what happens in the South. They had to pay for the war. They didn't know how to pay for the war. Do you just go into debt? They did go into debt. Two things that they did will become kind of a roadmap for the 20th century. One, they imposed taxes. Again, up to this point, largely, you paid very little taxes. And there was actually even a tax on income for like the upper third of the northern citizens. So that had never happened before, and it'll be changed really quickly after the war is over, and we won't have such an income tax till Wilson approves the amendment to the Constitution in his presidency. But the other thing they do is they sold war bonds. And so the idea of getting people to pay for a bond in which they would get a slight, interest on the other end was a way to raise money for that. So that became kind of a big deal. Notice also that one of the challenges on the home front and in the war itself was that disease sort of ran rampant. And in many cases, on the battlefield, more people died from disease either that day of the battle or later, and we'll see an example of that in a few moments with a very famous death, than they did just being shot and dying at the moment. That there's diseases that occurred either post-surgery or just through the armies. The industry will blow up. So remember, one of the things we talked about was that, for instance, the Anaconda Plan was designed to use naval shipping to blockade the South. Well, when the war started, we had about 40 ships. So you can't blockade, Jacksonville to New Smyrna with 40 ships, not well. And they wanted to go from Virginia all the way up to the Gulf into Texas. So they started building ships. By the time the war is over, we'll have the third largest Navy. Guns, cannons, technology development, all these things are going to be taking place. And the North had an industry prepared for that. Unfortunately, the South did not. But the North also, in one sense, is really fighting two different things. That's not saying it very well. In one sense, I guess you would say, as I heard one historian say, the North was fighting with one hand tied behind its back, meaning it was sort of distracted. So as an example, one of the best examples is in 1862, the Homestead Act is passed. And you may know that from your study of the American West, right? So at this point, the Homestead Act was when the government says, hey, we'll give you land, 160 acres later, up to 320 acres if you want to do ranching, as long as you paid a little fee and you went and lived there. Build a house, you're good. We'll give you the land for nothing. And of course, thousands of people will go west. After the Civil War, Southerners will get the opportunity also. But the point is, the South's fighting for its life with basically everybody engaged in the fighting. Upwards to 80% of most men participated in the active fighting, and that meant all the women were doing it, which we'll show you in just a second. But in the North, we could just say, hey, look, some of you want to move west, go ahead, we don't need you. And then I love that fact that the Ivy League schools, which were pretty much our only colleges, they went on with their sports. They still had what they considered, sports. They weren't, crew was the big one, the regattas, but still, they're not having to send people off to war. Meanwhile, in the South, that's not the case. The blockade will become effective by late 62, early 63. There are some blockade runners, but in general terms, whatever was the Southern economy will be ruined. And any attempts by the Congress to try to fix things will be ineffective. One of the things is they did it to themselves, because one of the plans you may remember from the Confederate strategy was to withhold cotton from England, assuming that the textile industry, which was the driving force of the early Industrial Revolution, would demand that England recognize the South and break through whatever blockade was there. That didn't happen because, as we've said, Lincoln was working really hard with the son of John Quincy Adams, Charles Adams. There's our diplomat in London to keep them neutral, right, to keep them out of it. And so in the meanwhile, London said, where else can we grow cotton? Hey, look, cotton grows in Egypt, so we're good. And so the South kind of blew that whole process. And so that's a transformation. But another transformation, again, back to the social change that occurs, was because the men were gone, the women had to take the lead. And from the plantation point of view, that meant that you no longer as a woman were necessarily just kind of managing the household, you're managing everything. But also women went to work, women took jobs. So it's kind of an early Rosie the Riveter kind of experience. Women became the lead merchant if their families owned a merchant situation or shop in some of the few southern towns. And women in some spots will vote, although that will not be anything that takes, will kind of grow and be accepted. At the same time, there is that beginnings of this kind of push for suffrage for women to be allowed to vote. In other words, just like you'll see in 1919 and 1945, the South in particular, for the South, when the men come back, the women have had 3 or 4 years of a sense of freedom and opportunity that hadn't happened before. And that will transform kind of the experience. I know we all think of the post-war South and it's still very patriarchal. That is true. But still, there's some seeds that are planted in the South amongst Southern women because they go to be the leaders of kind of the economy, of the culture. However, their industry was really poor, right? They did have the famous blockade runners you may have heard about, like the CSS Alabama, CSA Alabama, and others. But really all they did was bring war materials or luxury goods. Many of these were privately owned, so they weren't really operating for the government. And so if you were risking your life and your ship to go to France or England to get supplies, what would you want? You'd want to know you're going to get paid. Well, who's most likely to be able to pay you? Wealthy plantation owners. So when they're asking for luxury goods, either furniture or clothing or wine or cigars, that's great. And that's great for them, and it's great for you, the blockade runner. But that's not really helpful to the economy. And as we saw last time, because the CSA never gained that recognition, they never had their Saratoga, well, they never got loans, they never got support, they weren't able to, kind of have an influx of cash that could help sort of stabilize and set up some industries. There are some industries built in some of the larger cities. So in Jackson and Mississippi, in New Orleans, before it's captured early, of course, Atlanta, near Birmingham, Richmond, these cities will develop some industries, but it's just getting going. And they're not really effectively able to have the money that they need, let alone the raw materials and that whole piece. So it's a real struggle. Meanwhile, the money that they have is worthless. They would print, bills, dollar bills, and yes, that is George Washington on the Confederate 50, but it was really basically just paper. It was almost as bad as Germany in the 1930s or 1920s with hyperinflation. And it was worthless. Meaning those people who worked and got paid with Confederate money really got nothing. And so that just leads to a real crisis in the society. This raises one of the key issues that I find so fascinating when you look at the experience of the society at this time and that point of transforming government. Right? Remember when we looked at the Confederacy, the Constitution? One of the things we looked at was how there was this kind of concept about states' rights, but how it wasn't really clearly articulated. They did clearly articulate their support for slavery, but the states' rights thing's not really there. Well, how do you set up a government for a nation if you aren't going to have any power in that government? And one of the things Davis finds out pretty much immediately is every time he tries to do something, he gets criticized for it, not only by the press, but from other political leaders who are like, you can't do that because we're not the same kind of country. And over again would be thrown in his face that, we left that country, meaning quit acting like the old government, we're doing a new thing. But then how do you set up an economy? How do you set up a system, right? The military is a great example of this. At no point does the Confederacy ever establish a kind of organized military to the very, very, very end. In 65, I think it is, Lee will be made commander-in-chief, which is kind of pointless at that part. And more than one time, Davis would try to be stepping into it saying, hey, we need to send some troops here, or we need to, who's going to decide this? And there was nobody to make the decision. And soldiers and generals could say, I'm not going there. And Lee, very famously, as we'll see probably next week, refuses to leave Virginia for a move that probably would have been better for the overall war experience, because he's like, I'm from Virginia, I'm defending Virginia. And Davis couldn't make him. So how do you organize this, right? And so they would try things. And of course, this is the exact same issue that we saw when we studied the Constitution a couple years ago, that the founders had set up the Confederation, the Articles of Confederation, to be the nation of the 13 colonies. And in less than a decade, all these problems were in the mix. Now, again, the supporters of this style of government would say, you didn't give it enough time, that we could have worked it out. At the time of our Constitution in 1780s, they argued loudly to stop Madison and Hamilton, unsuccessful. But they said we didn't have enough time. Now, because for the South, there's a war going on. So it's hard to build a government with a war going on, and they never win the war, so they don't really get that time involved. But I think the point is most easily defended to say that the problem lies with the style of government if you're going to have a nation at large. You see it with the EU today when they're dealing with the coronavirus. Who makes the decision? Who gets to ultimately decide what Europe will do if there's no organizing government? So some of the things that they tried to do, you can see, is they set up a draft. And the Confederacy will actually set up a national draft. They'll set up a tax system for which they really could not really get a lot of money because most people did not have cash on hands to pay. So then they would have to pay in what was called tax in kind, which meant you owe this much money, give us your pigs or your grains. Give us your wagon sometimes. Take one of your horses or your mule. So that became problematic for the South. And the fact that it was enforced by this group called the Home Guard really raised some questions and ultimately becomes a big negative for the Confederacy in a society that said, hey, we're establishing this mostly to give individual rights to people, just to live as you want to live. When you then set up kind of felt like a dictatorial type government, at least locally through a Home Guard, in which there was no voting, there was no representation, it was the opposite of what they said they were trying to accomplish. So this undercuts them. Davis, like Lincoln, will also suspend habeas corpus. And we've talked about this before with Lincoln, but I just want to kind of hit this a little bit harder for a moment. Habeas corpus is one of the main foundational points of the idea of liberty that emerges with the Glorious Revolution in the 1680s. So that whole period of that 80-year run to their great crisis moment in the 1670s and 1680s was all coming out of the previous cycle into the 1500s, in which the debate or the question was centered around, does a free individual who's not a noble have any rights? And men like Locke and Hobbes will argue the point that they do, and ultimately in 1680 they will win those rights with a Civil War type struggle against the ruling king at the time. And so in the process there, the idea of habeas corpus, which is Latin for show the body, basically. And you think back to the Middle Ages, the idea that a king could just lock you up for whatever reason, say you hadn't paid your taxes, and you're going to stay in jail for years and years and years, and nobody would know where you went, what happened to Carl, what happened to that guy, I don't know anymore. Well, now, as you know, if you get arrested, usually it's 48 hours, like may have 72 hours in which they can keep you locked up. But of course, you have your one phone call. But if they keep you longer than that, that's illegal. So they can get in trouble. Davis will jail opponents. He'll jail journalists. He's trying to protect the idea of the government. But to do it, he's got to go into this dictatorial way. And you can see what his vice president said there. You can see he got support from men like Lee. Lee's like, yeah, we have to do this. But obviously there are others who are very opposed. Towards the end of the war in 65, as Sherman's marching into South Carolina and then ultimately into North Carolina, the Union Army discovered factories full of uniforms. When asked about it, of course, you may know enough to realize that one of the images, right, of the Civil War is that the Union Army was well provided for, and the poor Confederate Army, they were very poor. They didn't often have shoes, and the whole, the story about going to Gettysburg for the shoes. Why would they do that? Because they didn't have the supplies, right? Marching into Maryland before Antietam to get supplies. Supplies. And then they find these just stacks and stacks and stacks of uniforms. And the governor of North Carolina is like, those are for North Carolinians. They're not for the Confederacy. They're for our people. They're made with our cotton, our sewers, well, is it a nation or not a nation, right? And it's that kind of debate, and these actions of suspending habeas corpus are a piece of that. Again, Lincoln does it. We already talked about this in Maryland, and I think I told you in that Maryland story that the Supreme Court Chief Justice, now not the Supreme Court itself, but the Supreme Court Chief Justice issued a stay in the ex parte Merryman, in which he said, hey, you can't do that, let these people out of jail. And Lincoln, basically mimicking Jackson 30 years before, said, yeah, make me. Sorry, not going to do it. And that, of course, raises some pretty deep issues about the relationship between the judicial branch and the executive branch. And in Taney's mind, it involved also the legislative branch, because both he and Lincoln knew that the Constitution says habeas corpus can be suspended, as you can see there, when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. Well, for Taney, since that's in Article 1, which is the part about Congress, that's only something Congress can do. And Lincoln was kind of broadening it, going, well, it's in the Constitution, I'm the president, I can do it. Now, Lincoln would admit that maybe he was off base, but he kind of was like Jackson going, I don't care. I'm going to do what I think needs to happen to defend the country, and not trying to get too close to current events, and certainly not trying to support or unsupport a president. But if you hear the federal government in 2020 say, we're going to do this about Portland or some other city, and people are like, you can't do that, and the president or others go, well, watch me, you can say to yourself, oh, wow, that's exactly what Andrew Jackson did. That's exactly what Abraham Lincoln did. And why? Because they deemed the safety of the country needed it. Trust me, in the South and in Maryland, there were just as many people who thought Lincoln had no business and no right to do what he did. In fact, there are people in the North who thought Lincoln had deeply overstepped and were afraid for, what that meant. And there's just a whole bunch of stuff that they were arguing against. So when I hear things today, of course, I'm always thinking, wow, who did that before? I'm not saying that the decisions by the federal government today are right or wrong relative to Portland. Email me that if you want to ask my personal question, my personal opinion. But it's not like President Trump and the government is doing a brand new thing. They're merely doing what many presidents have done before. And it's not just Lincoln and it's not just Jackson. Now, Lincoln will keep doing it. He'll do it for the whole war. So, he's got people in jail up until 64 and he doesn't care. Now, arguably, he could have done more, because Lincoln will be viciously attacked throughout by the media. The media and the press largely hated Lincoln. So if he wanted to really go after journalists and editors, he could have. He, from one point of view, was restrained. The military experience raises a whole other issue for the home front, right? So again, as we said, people knew people going to war. And as we saw from Bull Run forward, it's been a brutal war. If you took time to talk about the military technology of the Civil War, which we're not, the killing ability had ramped up deeply, even since the Mexican War, right? In fact, I argue the Civil War is the first modern war, or it certainly is the war that presages what will happen in 1914 to 1919, World War I. The Southern experience was overwhelming. As you can see, over 70% will usually go to fight. In some places, 80%. You'll see that they expand the military age, and there are multiple examples in both North and South of young boys, sometimes actually women, but in this case, young boys as young as 14, 13, and 12 years old going off to be in the war. And that, of course, raises all kinds of issues on the home front also, as the devastation of the war occurs, but also, as we've already seen, in the missing of those people. In the Confederacy, as we already mentioned, first draft law, April of 62. Lincoln and the Congress will match it in spring of 63. Well, the draft's not till July. In both examples, they left out clauses for the wealthy. Again, this is not the only time that's happened in our national history. Both allowed you to pay for or get a substitute of some kind. You can see in the South the quote unquote 20 Negro law, that if you had that many slaves, you could be left off the list. Now, in the South, I'll just note, in the South, that was not used all that often because, again, of this sense of the chivalry or the need to go and defend. There wasn't a whole group of, young, rich, wealthy young men who were not participating. To some degree, the cultural pressure in the South was no matter who you were, you needed to be there, because in their minds, once we win, if you didn't participate, you're going to have a hard time finding your way in society. In both cases, there's famous quotes from average Southerner, average Northern person. The Southern one was, it's a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. in the North, in New York. A gentleman was heard to say the blood of a poor man is as precious as that of the wealthy. But they didn't change the law. So there's that pressure that gets us into an economic division and scenario in the North and the South. Because of this, there is a protest that occurs. There's a deep, deep protest that comes in by 63. In the North, it's mostly about the draft. It's also somewhat against the Emancipation Proclamation, which, as I told you, was really the most unpopular thing Lincoln did. Think about that, more unpopular than the suspending habeas corpus. So that tells you a lot about the North. In the South, it was almost always about lack of food and or actions by the Home Guard. So there were riots and protests in small little towns, and that was really more feeling that they were being oppressed by their own people. But in the larger cities, and most famously in April in Richmond, and in both cases, the military is called out. Yet again, an echo to what we're seeing now, though technically the military, as far as I know, has not been called out anywhere in the country. Agents of the Homeland Security, which is part of the federal government, have been, but I don't believe the Army has been called out to quell any riots that I'm aware of. But if you wonder about that, it's not the first time in 2020, right? It's not the first time. And a president, in both cases, Lincoln and Davis, deciding, you know what? These people are out of control. They don't want to listen to reason. They're causing violence and protests. And in the North, it becomes a race riot. As Democrats in particular lead the way in blaming African-American and freedmen as for causing the war. Again, it's connected to the Emancipation Proclamation. So the military is called out. And this basically gives in both the North and the South kind of an anti-war development. And I just called it in the North a pro-secession movement, kind of anti-emancipation kind of movement. That's kind of what we were looking at here. Again, the press was almost 80-20 against Lincoln. If you read the press of 63, even after Gettysburg, you would assume that the South had captured Illinois and Indiana and Pennsylvania and parts of New York, when it's completely the opposite. But the press was spinning it a certain way against Lincoln. It didn't help that in the end of 62, as we've already seen, the battles were not glorious victories that I guess people assume that they should be. Clement Vallandigham is the most famous of a group of Midwesterners. So it's really interesting that this comes from Lincoln's own Illinois, Ohio, which we saw Ohio kind of the center of kind of the Emancipation Proclamation and the Underground Railroad. Remember we talked about Ohio was this place, the Underground Railroad was a big deal. And so, you know, here in Ohio, Southern Ohio, obviously Kentucky, Missouri, that whole section, there's this group of, they took a penny and they would cut out Lincoln, the head of the penny, which we didn't have Lincoln on it, obviously at the time. And they would somehow be able to pin it or put it on their lapel. So they had a copper head. It's not the snake copper head. And they would put it on, I think it had Liberty on it. And they would wear it. And these were congressmen. So they're in DC, but they're also back in their home states. And growing up around them was this kind of anti-war, even pro-secession movement. Now think back when we talked about the border states. We talked about how at the same time that the border states were considering what they should do, that there were some leaders who were saying that maybe those states, so in this case we're talking about Delaware, New Jersey, maybe Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, that they should form their own confederation. There were some who would even talk about maybe we should try to become part of Canada in some way. And again, most of these are small numbers of people. We would call them fringe groups or minor leaders. But obviously Vallandigham is a leader. These were not just crazy people. These were people who had been elected to office and who were speaking against the war in very strong terms. Eventually, Lincoln will use habeas corpus, suspend it, and basically banish Vallandigham to the Confederacy. He'll leave and ultimately get to Canada, where again, some of these rumors of pro-secession, join Canada movement had come. There were some in 63 in the Confederacy, excuse me again, who were spies. There's always a spy war thing going on, all wars. And up in Canada, trying to raise troops either Canadian troops or Northerners who were anti-Lincoln, to get them to kind of have some, if we can't get England to invade from Canada, maybe we can get Canadians to do so. So it's a real kind of interesting moment when you look at the history. Just like 100 years from now, when they look at the history of 2020, you don't know yet how they're going to write that. Remember, I'm not saying again who you should or shouldn't like or agree with, but I'll just say that Lincoln was deeply vilified in what he was doing at this moment. Again, not saying, not comparing, just wanting you to constantly be thinking in terms of reflection, just kind of be thinking about, wow, we don't really know how it's going to be written in our future about this moment. In the South, same sort of thing. As you can see here, I've got two movies up here for you. If you like watching movies, these two movies do a good job of digging in to this idea of the Southern experience. There actually were moments in which certain groups of Southerners will, being so frustrated with Davis and the war and this idea of it being a rich man's war, like we're fighting for the plantation owners, we're not fighting for the rest of us, but they'll just give up. As you can see, by 64, the idea of leaving the army becomes very strong. And there were several tens of thousands of young men or men of fighting age, to use that way, who left. If they could go AWOL, they would. If they could avoid doing the work, if they could get back to their farms, their wives and loved ones were suffering, usually financially, in some settings, due to that home guard kind of sense of the guys who didn't go, but they stayed back to protect, all of a sudden becoming more tyrannical, quite honestly. And so in these various places, that happened. The movie Free State of Jones highlights the Mississippi, but they weren't the only ones where that was the situation. And so you've got in the South kind of this anti-war protest that's really leading to seceding from the South. So it's kind of, just this really interesting dynamic on the home front. This leads or connects also, particularly for the South, to a refugee movement. We don't often think of the United States as having refugees. We sometimes are worried about dealing with people from other countries, but we've had our moment, and this is one of them, in which there was a deep refugee situation. As the war would come, and obviously the Union Army with it, people would flee. Now, wealthy people, particularly when you think about, like, say, the coastlines or in, enjoyable location, they would go, to the nearest city, right? So people left the sea islands of South Carolina and Georgia and went into Savannah and Charleston. And for at least most of the war, they could pull that off. Others would go into more rural areas. Rural people often resented these people showing up. They didn't often know how to cook for themselves or feed themselves or really work in a farming environment. They were used to having slaves, particularly the wealthy people. And then on the other side of it, you had people like where I'm from in East Tennessee, who they had to flee their homes because of persecution by Southerners because they were Unionists. So that's a smaller number, but again, you have this kind of refugee movement leaving from their homes to going to, where they could be protected. And for the slaves, before, but particularly after the Emancipation Proclamation, you start seeing this. Now for them, you largely see them kind of in the wake of the army. So where the army would go, look back 20 miles, 30 miles, and there'd be this kind of coming group of people. But in many cases, they were recognizing that they weren't safe, and so they needed to get to some place. So they would usually end up in an urban society, which will explain why in the late 19th, early 20th century, you will find higher congregation population numbers of African Americans in some of the southern cities when they would not have been that way before the war. They were looking for places where they could be saved. New Orleans is captured, we saw very early in the war, so we'll go there, right? And so we'll get to that place where we can be protected, which will set up part of the problem of what we see happening in the Reconstruction period itself. Okay, I think we have just enough time for me to set up what's going to happen in 63. That's kind of what I thought would happen. I think it's good. Boy, I wish I could stop right now and talk to you guys and get questions, because I feel like there's probably more we could dig in on the home front experience. The thing about 63, and again, this is why for me Antietam's this moment, up to that moment, what you've seen largely are single battles set off in these moments. And there were more than the ones we've looked at. There's actually dozens and dozens and dozens of battles, but they're, typically smaller clashes, but they were happening, but they'd be, 4 hours, an 8-hour thing, occasionally like Shiloh, 2 days, that was it. From 63 on, we're going to be talking about military campaigns. And again, this is one of the reasons why I think it's more fair to say the Civil War is really the first modern war. Because when we think of modern war, 20th century war, that's what you're thinking about. Long campaigns where guys are gone forever and they're fighting all the time, even in the winter. Battle of the Bulge, right? There's fighting going on all the time. Well, that's going to begin to happen here, where we're just in long campaigns. And there will be 4 or 3 really long campaigns that occur, one in Mississippi, one through Tennessee, sort of Nashville to Chattanooga, and then on to Atlanta for 64. And then 2 or 1 really in Northern Virginia, leading famously to Gettysburg. So let me set up what's happening in Mississippi. That's what we'll do. We'll just set up Mississippi. I think that'll be where we stop. We'll see. So as you remember, the Battle of Shiloh occurs right up here at Pittsburgh Landing, right here. And even though it's really a victory for the Union, quite honestly, Grant was put on the back burner. And so for the rest of 62, they ultimately, the North is able to take Corinth. And as you can see, in December of 62, Grant's back in charge. But he's kind of back with the Army. Meanwhile, Sherman, who's not under Grant at this point, will ultimately lead the way down the river. I showed you that one map a couple of weeks ago where basically all the river, except for Vicksburg, is taken. Now, both Lincoln and Davis thought Vicksburg was vital. I have never been convinced that it was vital because, one, it doesn't technically split the Confederacy. Splitting the Confederacy would be here somewhere in Alabama, right? And while there is some supplies and materials coming from Arkansas, Louisiana, and of course Texas to the west, it's not like there's this huge avalanche of supply that was coming from those places. One, Arkansas had largely been occupied by 62, 63. New Orleans and Baton Rouge is already captured. So there's a little bit of supply coming from the west. It's not like there's massive armies of Texans marching around. But in the minds of both Davis and Lincoln, and they were there, I wasn't, so we'll assume that they're right, it was crucial. Lincoln said it's the key. Till the key's in our pocket, we can't win. Everybody basically sort of thought, once you take Vicksburg, this thing's over. It wasn't, obviously, but Grant was in charge of doing this. Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia are still largely free for the Confederacy, and Grant will deal with or be confronted with both cavalry groups, famously by Nathan Bedford Forrest, not as famously by Earl Van Dorn, although Earl Van Dorn probably did more to harm Grant than Forrest did. But one of the things that they did was going to be really interesting, setting up what happens at Vicksburg, is that it convinced Grant to move to the west side of the river to kind of be able unimpeded with supply basically. He was here, and he could have basically just marched down through the center of the state. And he chose not to. Later, he'll realize he made a mistake. So what will happen is when they get down to Vicksburg, Vicksburg is beautifully situated if you wanted to defend it from capture. One, it's above the river. So there's some pictures, I probably should have got you a picture of this. There's probably 30, 40 feet. It's not like it's mountain, but you can't just like get off a boat and walk into town. You have to climb a hill. So you couldn't invade from the river. And then as you can see, the river makes a really sharp bend. I love this map that Sherman had drawn, really sharp bend, right? So what that meant is as any boats came down the river, remember Grant was kind of leading the way in combined ops between Army and Navy. They could be shelled by Confederate cannons who by being elevated would have reach. They could reach way up to here to have the ability to hit ships on their way down, and then the ship would have to come up and then go down, so you could basically hit it twice. So it was very, very difficult to try to just ride a ship into it. And then, as you can see here, north of the city it's very marshy, it's very boggy. Not so much today necessarily, but certainly at that time, it was swampy. And in rainy season, it was really swampy. So you couldn't just like, he couldn't march down here and then march directly east north of the city. And when he gets down here, Grant realizes, I've made a mistake. Actually, in December, Sherman tries to make a direct frontal attack from here, and it's a terrible disaster for the Union Army, and he's beaten back. So he's like, well, that's not going to work. So for the whole spring, starting early in January of 63, Grant is going to try to think of different ways to get back to the dry side of Mississippi. As you can see, he's got 5 very famous things that he does: January, February, March, and April. And he's trying to figure out a way to get his army over there, and he can't. They all fail. They tried flooding. So up here, the Yazoo Pass, that was basically, they broke a dike that was normally there and tried to flood it to bring the army, the boats down this way on the inside. Couldn't do it. They tried to dig a canal. There's Grant's Canal right there. Back on this right here. They tried to dig a canal right there, thinking that they dug a canal there, they're south of the city, they'd be able to get across. Well, that didn't work either. They tried to dig a different canal, the wrong way, sorry. Tried to dig a different canal. Anyway, they're trying. Now, Grant says in his memoirs, by the way, I want to tell you, if you've never read Grant's memoirs, you should. Grant's memoirs are wonderfully written. He did it, obviously, himself towards the end of his life, really trying to find a way to find some money for his family, and he loses everything in a financial disaster later in the country after the war in 1780s, 70s, 80s. It's really wonderful. When Grant's like, I knew they weren't going to work, I'm not so sure he's telling the truth. You have selective memory when you look back 30 years. What were you really feeling? And he's like, nope, I didn't know they were going to work. But what he knows is, I can't get back here. Now, again, we could say what he should have done was just sail back upriver and then land and march back down the way he started to come. But remember what we just got finished talking about at home front. By early 63, it is very clear to everyone that the war is sour for everyone. Well, now that's actually worse for the North than the South. One, because the South is content to just play defense. If the North quits attacking them, then by de facto, we'll be a country. We'll still be here. And remember, Lincoln's going to have an election in 64. Davis is not, because Davis is in a 6-year single term. So the Confederate leaders begin thinking our chance of winning will not include England. We've already kind of figured that out. But now they begin thinking about that other idea that we told you that they missed at the start. What if we can make the war as painful as possible? Well, Lincoln may not be willing to surrender, but a Democrat would. You've got the right Democrat. That's a whole different conversation we'll have later. So Grant knows this. And so he's like, we can't go north to Memphis, even if we're just going to go north and march back down. Because one, that would mean we probably would not be down here until August or September, if then, and it'll look like we're retreating. The press will make this Grant's retreating. So I can't do that. I got to go a different way. And so what he's going to do is one of the most audacious moves in U.S. military history. That includes now, and includes, Ike and Patton. It may be what Grant does in 63, the most audacious and brave move of any commander in our national experience. And I can't wait to tell you about it next time. Everybody likes to brag on Lee, and he does some really good stuff. He's a very good general, but Grant is no slouch. You can see here, Grant's got his opponents, he's got his enemies, but Lincoln stands by him. He's like, I'm going to stand by him. I believe in him, and he helps him on more than one occasion. And the Vicksburg campaign will become the linchpin for the other campaigns. You can see up here the picture of Tennessee just in this one map, just to bring it up. There's a couple of times when Grant is begging Rosecrans, who was about as bad as McClellan, to attack, and he doesn't, and Bragg ultimately will attack. We'll get to this later. But so Grant begging Rosecrans to attack is to make sure that his work on Vicksburg is unimpeded by Bragg or anybody else. And then later, as you see here on the slide, I mean, not later, like in chronological later, but like at this very moment, Davis and Lee are going, what are we going to do? Remember, Davis is from Mississippi. So this is that moment where he goes to Lee and says, you need to go to Mississippi, or at least send part of your army to Mississippi, because it doesn't look like the Union's going to attack us necessarily. And Lee's like, nope, not doing that. But in the meantime, the Union changes generals and puts in one of the few generals who did well at Antietam, Joe Hooker. And so Hooker was a little brash, little rash. You can see there, this is the last slide. Lincoln was worried. He was excited about his energy because, again, who had we just had? McClellan. And then Burnside was just bumbling and bumbled into the disaster at Fredericksburg. And Hooker's like, we'll use the disaster at Fredericksburg to our advantage. We'll have the army stay there because they had been there since the battle. They didn't go back to DC. So we'll use that and we'll try to do a flanking maneuver. So Hooker is thinking like McClellan thought, we'll go around Lee, and he was going to, as you can see from the arrows, do a pincer attack on Lee, and then he was going to unleash his cavalry to go down and try to cut the supply down to Richmond. So this is kind of the journey, but remember look what Lincoln says to him. You have confidence in yourself, you're ambitious, but beware rashness. So we'll see how that plays out. We'll wrap up Vicksburg. This is going to be the Battle of Chancellorsville, and it all fits in with what Lee does with Gettysburg, which I promise we will get to next time. I really hope you're enjoying the look at this. Some of you do like to read, and I did show you his memoirs. If you wanted a really good, simple overview book of the Civil War, I use Christopher Olson's book, The American Civil War. I've used it as a textbook when I've been able to teach this class at the College of Valencia. It's a simple book. It's an easy read. It's got some great primary sources with each chapter, and Olson does a really, really good job. If you want to go deep on Grant, Jean Edward Smith, her book is wonderful, and I highly recommend it to you also. All right, again, I appreciate you spending time with me. If you have any questions about anything, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Email is great, and hopefully you had a good time tonight. I hope there wasn't some technology issues. Somebody may have suggested there was. Hopefully you got through that okay. And I will see you next week as we'll look at the big famous battle, and we'll see what happens in April, May. That really, does transform the country as we look at Gettysburg and finish up with Vicksburg. All right, everybody. Thank you. Have a good night.
Night, Carl. Thank you.